Welcome back to STAAR History Blitz. My name is Mrs. B. Gonzalez, and we are going to be discussing the causes of the Civil War. Remember, in our last video session, we introduced the three causes: slavery, sectionalism, and states' rights. Let's really dive deep into those causes. So sectionalism becomes a cause of the Civil War. And what this means is that the United States was divided into three sections during this time. And the people living within those sections are now pledging allegiance to their section, meaning they love their section more than the United States. And so the reasons why this happened were economic reasons. Firstly, the United States was divided in their economy. The North was an industrial nation, meaning they had manufacturing factories. All of that happened because of the geographic features of the North. They had fast flowing, numerous rivers. They had a lot of rivers that powered their textile factories that eventually led to making the North an industrial region. Now the South, because of its geography, the flat, fertile land, they profited from agriculture, cash crops. And what initially was tobacco, their main cash crop, later cotton became king. That became the main staple crop that spearheaded their economy. Now the West, what do we know about the West, specifically California? They found gold, right? 1849, California gold rush, 49ers. And they were known for their economy was mining and mineral ores, these precious metals that they had. So because of these geographic and economic differences, it led to sectionalism. Now, as we continue, let's talk about states' rights. That is a third cause of the Civil War. So again, slavery, we talked about that under abolitionists. Sectionalism, we just mentioned it. Now let's get into states' rights, which actually has to do with slavery and sectionalism. Allowing slavery in the territories of the United States continued to be an issue. The North didn't want slavery to spread to the West. The South said, we need it. We've exhausted our soil in the South. We need, fresh soil, which can only be found in the West. So these tensions continue to increase. Think about a rubber band, right? If we have a rubber band and these things are happening like slavery and the abolitionist movement, it's pulling. Sectionalism, it's pulling. That tension is increasing. Now, states' rights is going to be another thing that causes that rubber band between the North and the South to continue to increase that tension. So let's talk about what exactly we mean by a series of compromises that lead eventually to civil war. The first compromise happened back in 1820. It is known as the Missouri Compromise. The issue was that the North had 11 free states. And when I say free states, that means slavery is not allowed there. And the South had 11 slave states. So that means slavery is allowed. So we were equal and balanced. That means every time each state sent their representatives to Congress to go make laws, there was an equal amount, right? There was an equal amount being sent, so everything was equal and fair. It was balanced. But in 1820, Missouri, which is right here, wants to be added to the United States. They have enough population, they've met all their requirements, and they want to be added to the United States as a slave state. So if we add it as a slave state, that means the balance between free and slave is not going to be there. It's going to be unbalanced. So who's going to have more power in Congress? The slave states. What do I mean by power? Well, the more representatives you send to Congress, the more votes you have, the more power you have to make decisions that favor you. So this became an issue. What do we do? And so they had to compromise. They had to agree. And what they said is they looked around the United States and they realized that there's a territory known as Maine up here in the North that meets the requirements to become a state. So they said, We got it. We're going to add Maine as a free state and Missouri as a slave state. And now things are going to be equal and fair. And so everyone's like, okay, yes, but Missouri is in the north. But Missouri is like kind of like in the northern part. What do we do now? And so what they said is they made a line. This line right here. And this line, the Missouri Compromise line, said that anything north of that, from here on out, is not going to have slavery. And everything south of that will allow slavery, the territories at least. And then this is a Missouri Compromise. Again, let's sum it up. Missouri Compromise. In order to keep the balance, Missouri is added as a slave state. Maine is added as a free state. And we have the Missouri Compromise line that says north of that, no slavery. South of that, slavery is allowed. Well, for 30 years, everyone is happy. We are keeping things balanced and fair. One for you, one for me. One free, one slave. But in 1850, we can no longer do that. California now has enough people to be a state. Why? Check out where California's at. Why? In 1848, we win the U.S.-Mexican War. We signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and now we control the Mexican territory, that Mexican cession, all of this that includes California. A year later, we strike gold, right? At Sutter's Mill, we find gold. Everyone rushes over there. In a year after that, there's enough people to make it a state. Well, California wants to be admitted as a free state, but it falls under the line, right? The Missouri Compromise line. So what do? There's no other territory that has enough people or requirement that meets the requirements to make it a slave state. So they have to make a compromise. They have to come to a decision, an agreement between the North and the South. If we're going to add California, a huge state, as a free state, then what are we going to give the South to make things or keep things balanced and fair? And so what they decide to do is they come up with a law. And the name of this law is the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act says that any runaway slave, that's a fugitive. If the slave is running away, it's a fugitive. And so any runaway slave can now be chased after by slave catchers in the North and brought back down. Before, they couldn't do that. If a slave ran away to the North, slave catchers couldn't go into Northern Territory to get them. And so this law said, yes, you can. Slave catchers can now go to the North and capture their runaway slaves and bring them back down to the South. And so when this law came up, the North said, okay, fine, we agree with it because we're going to get California, right? And so they agreed and they made the Compromise of 1850. California is a free state. It's admitted as a free state. And the South gets the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. What they didn't realize, what was going to happen, so pay attention to this because it's an unintended effect. What they didn't realize what was going to happen was that slave catchers were going to be going up to the North to capture fugitive slaves, but they were also going to be kidnapping freed men. Men in the North who had always been free their entire life were being kidnapped and brought down to the South to be slaves. This was an unintended effect. The North didn't realize this was going to happen, and that's what ended up happening. Okay, so again, members of both groups, freedmen and runaway slaves, are being kidnapped and brought back down to the South. This angered abolitionists, and people started to join the abolitionist movement because of this. So here comes another compromise, but this time it doesn't have to do with states. It has to do with territories. They start to argue about territories allowing slavery, right? And so what they decide in the territories of Kansas and Nebraska is to allow the people to vote if they're going to choose to have slavery or not. This is known as one of our 7 principles, popular sovereignty. Again, popular means people and sovereignty means power. So the people in Kansas and Nebraska were allowed to vote for or against slavery. Now, when they made this decision and said, we're going to allow everyone through popular sovereignty to vote for or against slavery, everyone started to flood Kansas and Nebraska. People started to rush over there to try and persuade others to choose what they wanted. And what ended up happening is fighting broke out, especially in Kansas, between both groups. And there was violence and death. And so this became known as Bleeding Kansas. So violence broke out in this territory. Let's move on to a landmark Supreme Court case that also dealt with slavery in the Western territories. Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1857. In this Supreme Court case, Dred Scott, a slave, sues his master for his freedom, saying that I was living in the North, I should be free. Well, it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the decision is several things. Number one, slaves are property, not citizens. Make sure you remember that. Slaves are property, not citizens. So because they're property and not citizens, they cannot sue, right? They cannot sue and take things to court. Therefore, Dred Scott will remain a slave, all right? And because slaves are property, so it keeps going, all right? So listen to this. Because slaves are property, can the government make laws to take your property away without a reason, without due process? No. The only reason why government can take away your property is if you don't pay your taxes or you break the law somehow. That's the only reason we can take your property away. Therefore, the government cannot say no slavery allowed here, because what's happening to the property you own? They're taking it away. So let's go back. Number one decision, slaves are property, not citizens. So because of that, the government cannot take your property away without due process. So what does that mean? All of these compromises that have to do with territories, saying slavery is allowed, slavery is not allowed, we can't do that. That's unconstitutional. Slaves are property, so the government cannot take your property away. Therefore, slavery is allowed in all the Western territories. And the Missouri Compromise that had that line that said from here north, no more slavery, that's unconstitutional. Because of this court case, it basically said that abolishing slavery is unconstitutional. Can you imagine the outrage that Northerners and abolitionists had because of this Supreme Court case, which just increases that tension between the North and the South? And so going back to these causes, sectionalism, because of their geography and their economy, there's that tension between them, and tariffs as well. The North needed tariffs, the South hated tariffs. Because of slavery as well, and we talked about how the North didn't really depend on slavery versus the South did because of the plantation system. And then finally, states' rights, all the way back to the nullification crisis and South Carolina saying tariffs are unconstitutional. And now these compromises, right? That also increased tension between the North and the South. So keep these causes in mind. Sectionalism, the three S's, sectionalism, slavery, and states' rights all contributed to the causes of the Civil War. And lastly, the straw that broke the camel's back. What that means is the last thing that really made the South so angry that caused them to go to war is the election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. And when you see the term Republican, you know that Republicans were against the spread of slavery to the West. All right. He opposed the extension of slavery. So as soon as he becomes president, guess what the South does? Especially South Carolina. they secede because they fear Lincoln as president is going to abolish slavery. In our next video lesson, you're going to see how South Carolina and 10 other southern states leave the United States, make their own states of America, and eventually war breaks out. So thank you so much for watching. My name is Mrs. P. Gonzalez, and we'll see you in the next one, the Civil War.